My name is Randy Mayu, and we have someone who's supposed to be coming on the way to do a discussion after I finish my portion. And when we tried to pick the books for the year, I had heard Taylor Branch, the author of this, I better start recording, I'm sorry. I had heard Taylor Branch speak at SMU. David, you invited me. I sat with you. Thank you. Yeah. And I bought my copy of this book at that event and had him autograph it. But I've still bought another copy on the Kindle app because that's how I read my books these days. So if you're not aware, Taylor Branch is, Gerald, I just started. Is that all right? Okay. All right. Taylor Branch won the Pulitzer for a book called Parting the Waters, America in the King Years. And I read that so long ago that my copy is buried in storage. It's very thick and hundreds of pages long. And it is really where I learned most of what I learned about that era. And he is the author of the era. He's the Pulitzer Prize winning author. This book has a very unusual approach. Each chapter has a short essay from Taylor Branch, and then he pulls together sections from Parting the Waters and his other 2 volumes. So he creates a flowing narrative where he says, this is the event, and then here's what I'd written about this earlier. I'm going to begin, and I would like to recommend that you all buy this. This is called Defining a Nation by David Halberstam. He is now deceased, but he was another Pulitzer Prize winner. And Larry James just told me that the best book on the civil rights movement is one I have not read. It's called The Children by David Halberstam. And this book is a collection of essays. To give you an example, Jim Lehrer has an essay in here on the greatest government program ever, the GI Bill. So this is a remarkable book, Defining a Nation. And this is a chapter written by David Halberstam. It's called The Children of a Revolution, the Fisk University Activists. And I'm going to read just a little bit from this essay. Now, 43 years later, the first thing I remember about them is their sense of purpose, which was so unshakable, and then their fearlessness. They were not really that fearless, of course. No one ever is in the face of death, but they seemed fearless as they went off to be assaulted each time by raging mobs of white segregationists. Diane Nash, and you're going to see her name in this handout. Diane Nash, the beautiful young woman from Chicago whom all the rest of them so admired and who half of the men were in love with, seemed utterly without fear. And that goaded many of the men to be a bit braver. But in fact, every day in her last class at Fisk, as she readied herself to go off to yet another sit-in, she was aware of her own mounting fear. Her palms began to sweat, and she would notice a huge, wet handprint, a fear print, really, on the desk of her English class. And then she would pull herself together and become the Diane Nash she was supposed to be, the Diane Nash who was always so cool and afraid of nothing in the eyes of her male peers. I just thought that was worth reading as we begin. So, what this book does is it takes moments. Notice that the subtitle is Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement. And so it takes moments, and then it tells just a little bit of the story. And I've really debated how to talk about this. I talked to Reverend Britt about this on the way in. I'm a white man. And no one has ever looked at me and immediately cast judgment because of my gender or my color. White men have enormous privilege in this society. And so I have tried very diligently to educate myself. And I know that I know nothing compared to the people who've experienced it. This May, next month, my wife and I are going on our third trip that I'm calling our own personal civil rights tour. We've been to Atlanta, we've been to Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, and we're going together to Memphis. I've been to Memphis and I've been to the Lorraine Motel, and yes, we will go to Graceland. Just so you know. I'm hoping to run into Elvis. I hear he's still secretly alive. But I called, and I found out that it is available to go into the auditorium at the Mason Hall, the Mason Temple, which is also the headquarters of Church of God in Christ, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his last speech on April 3rd, 1968. I've been to the mountaintop. And I know the look of that auditorium, and I asked the person when I called, is the auditorium like it was in 1968? And she said yes. So I've tried to educate myself. But what I do not understand is the vociferous ugliness of the white people who just did not want integration to occur. And you realize integration, what they were worried about was equality. They didn't want equality. And I don't understand that. I don't think. So anyway, let's look at the front. We're just going to work through this one. What is the point? The civil rights movement rose and fell and rose on certain key moments. This book chronicles those moments, and yes, they revolve around Martin Luther King Jr. Now let me remind you that of course the civil rights movement is older than these years. It started with A. Philip Randolph, and it started with W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, I still can't, Gerald says it one way. By the way, Gerald, this book confirms the Mahalia Jackson story.
Oh, is that right?
On the I Have a Dream speech. Yeah. So anyway, it's incorrect to say that there was no civil rights movement before these years. But it is commonly believed, and this author believes, that something pretty major happened beginning December 1, 1955. If you want to write that date down. December 1, 1955. That is the day that Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for not giving up her seat on the bus. And he basically says, and we'll wrap up this era on April 4, 1968, if you want to write that date down. And that's the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And so these moments revolve around Martin Luther King Jr. Why is this book worth our time? This book is a compilation of key passages of the major works of the Pulitzer Prize winning author Taylor Branch. He made the selections. This is his selection of passages that he put into one volume. And it's like reading the best of the best chosen by the best. So I kind of, some of you are not old enough to understand this phrase. It's like a really good volume of the Reader's Digest version. No. All right, number two, whether you know the history well or you don't know the history at all, this sweeping look provides context and insight. I know a lot of this history. I've read a lot of books about it. And yet, I found myself kind of seeing the big picture in a better way after reading this book. And I think if you don't know the history, this would be the starting point because it will give you the key moments. Number three, I just tried to list all I could think of. Discrimination, hatred, prejudice. These are all still, sadly, way too present. In the state of Oregon, this week, a man was sentenced to life in prison because he intentionally ran his car into and killed a black person. And it was tried both as murder and a hate crime, and there is zero doubt that he picked out an African American to do that to. So this book reminds us how deeply the roots of such views and behaviors are planted. Now I'm going to go ahead and kind of tell you the story in a nutshell. On December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks was arrested, they had a meeting in a large church auditorium in Montgomery that night while she's under arrest. And the meeting was run by the young pastor who was relatively new in town. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. And if he had not been in Montgomery, if he'd moved to a different city, if he'd gotten there 2 years later or 2 years earlier, we might not have heard of Martin Luther King Jr. He was there the night that they decided to launch the Montgomery bus boycott. And what happened was, from that point on, through 1963, Birmingham, the fire hoses, the dogs in Birmingham, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, 64 and 65, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then, you know, he got the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he's also, in his last speech, speaking to garbage collectors in Memphis. And every step of the way, governors lied, federal officials lied, J. Edgar Hoover spied on King, put out some very ugly slam pieces about King, and every effort, whether it be sit-ins or freedom riders, every effort, I'm not exaggerating much, they would arrive in a town and the official police protection that had been promised would kind of pull back, and the white people with the clubs would come and attack them. At one point the bus was burned, there were people killed, there were bodies not found, there were lynchings. I mean, it's just overwhelming how energetically and in an ugly fashion the white people said, we are not going to grant equality. And it is astonishing that King and his army of helpers, and boy did I come to appreciate how much everybody mattered, how much they put up with and kept going and would not stop. It is a remarkable story. So, I'm now going to be reading basically everything you see almost to the end of the handout is right out of the book. So these are the best of my best highlights from the book. And I'm not going to be able to read them all, but we're going to read a bunch of them. So here we go. So this is more like a book reading. Have you ever been to an author's book reading where they read a section of the book? I'm reading sections of the book in short bites to get us through the narrative. In the preface, beyond state and local laws, which mandated racial separation everywhere, from schools and businesses to public libraries, custom enforced segregation in houses of worship. So you understand that it was against the law for Rosa Parks to sit in the front of the bus. It was against the law for a black person to go eat at a lunch counter. If you're young, a lunch counter was picture McDonald's in a drugstore, and the hamburgers were better and the milkshakes are to die for. And those aren't around much anymore. All right? I resolved to present my findings in storytelling form rather than the analytical synthesis common to history. The goal was to pursue stories of impact, circle that phrase, stories of impact, until the clashing characters felt convincing by all available evidence, including their own lives. He says Septima Clark and Vernon Johns are omitted from these pages, along with many other figures I consider historically significant. Brevity offsets their absence. In other words, there are a lot of heroes in this book, but there are a lot of heroes not mentioned that are part of the story, and it's a shame we don't have time to deal with every one of them. Above all, the King years should serve as a bracing reminder that citizens and leaders can work miracles together despite every hardship against great odds. So, that's from the preface. And now, each chapter is a moment. And what you got on the handout is the chapter and the year, and then a couple of highlights, or a few highlights. Chapter 1, the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King's first public address, 1955. I got to tell you, I teach speech, I study speeches, I love this book. There are lots of pieces of speeches throughout this book, and I'm going to make a point in just a minute. A self-evident truth asserted in the 1776 Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The last speech of his life, 2 minutes and 37 seconds before he sat down, and I know that because that's the beginning of a video that I show regularly, he said, all we're asking is that America be true to what it says on paper. That's a line from I've Been to the Mountaintop. And here he's saying, remember what America says on paper. All are created equal. Yes, it's masculine language. It wasn't written in gender neutral. Sorry about that. Even today, the civil rights cause is associated in common parlance with Americans of African descent. An intense phase of the story, known as the modern civil rights movement, coincided with the short public career of its signature leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., 1954 to 1968. Those are not the years he lived, those are his career years, and the real beginning was that date in 1955. Chief Justice Earl Warren had written, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The Emmett Till case, that happened earlier in 1955. It was the boy who was killed. The people who killed him were found not guilty by an all-white jury, and then they told, I think it was Look magazine, may have been Life, but I think it was Look, they told how they killed him. And because of double jeopardy, they could not be tried again. The Till case revealed a gaping chasm between real life and the Supreme Court's arid pronouncement of equality in law. The hostile press later estimated the crowd at 5,000 people. This is the night Rosa Parks was arrested. They gathered and they had 5,000 people. But the Negroes put it at least 2 or 3 times that figure. Let me jump ahead and make a disclaimer. When you see the word Negro, that was the word used by Dr. King and African Americans in the early 60s. It was the acceptable term. Of course, that would not be true today. So when you see it on these papers, it's a quote from the book. You will also see the N-word a couple of times. And that's quoting from the ugly people. And you'll see that in this book. So King had a friend named Finley. And as he's going to the crowd, he says to Finley, you know something, Finley? This could turn into something big. And it did. All right. Now, this is excerpts of the speech King gave that night. We are here in a general sense because, first and foremost, we are American citizens. And we are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its means. Just the other day, just last Thursday to be exact, one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, so this is a few days later, not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens in Montgomery was taken from a bus and carried in jail and arrested because. I'm happy it happened to a person like Mrs. Parks. He said, for nobody can doubt the boundless outreach of her integrity. Nobody can doubt the height of her character. Nobody can doubt the depth of her Christian commitment. And you know, my friends, there comes a time, he cried, when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. So he's quite a speaker from the beginning. Now, I'm going to pretend we're in speech class. Notice the 3 uses of the phrase, nobody can doubt. This is parallel structure, and once you get that into your head, you will see it in every speech he ever gives. I have a dream that one day, I have a dream that one day, let freedom ring, 100 years later, this is no time, now is the time. If I had sneezed. If you don't know that one, read I've Been to the Mountaintop. Just Google it and read the text. You'll find it in American Rhetoric. And find the passage, "If I had sneezed." It's my favorite passage by him. Okay, all right. Number 9, if we were incarcerated behind the iron curtains of a communistic nation, we couldn't do this. If we were trapped in the dungeon of a totalitarian regime, we couldn't do this. And now, those are part of his speech, and now you begin to see that he repeated key ideas throughout his career, because those ideas are in the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, and some of the lines he gave elsewhere landed in the "I have a dream" speech. I want it to be known that we're going to work with grim and bold determination to gain justice on the buses in this city. And we are not wrong. Here's another parallel. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. From the book of Amos, requoted in "I Have a Dream," and I suspect many times by him. So Taylor Branch says King would work on his timing, but his oratory had just made him forever a public person. Okay, I'm not going to read all of the excerpts. You can read them on your own, but I'll hit all the chapters in 1 or 2 each. Chapter 2, Sit-ins and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, 1960. Gerald, is that pronounced SNCC? All right, they pronounced that SNCC. And there were a number of different organizations that popped up. Dr. King was the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so, lots of them. So, he wanted to spread it. And so, discreetly, he consulted Billy Graham about how the celebrated evangelist crusade model might convert the white South from segregation city by city. That was interesting. And by the time you get to other events, some fundraisers in Los Angeles and the "I Have a Dream" speech, I'm not going to remember all these. You've got James Garner and Marlon Brando and Paul Newman. At one event, Paul Newman wrote the first check for $1,000. So there were white celebrities that helped out, and there was Billy Graham behind the scenes. King visited India, and by the way, in 1960, Billy Graham was big. He was big. So, all right. King visited India in 1959 to find puzzling splits among the heirs of the nonviolent pioneer Mahatma Gandhi. All right. One of the things that I came away with was this. You know, we read these stories and we treat these icons as great champions. Rosa Parks was such a champion. "I Have a Dream" and the March on Washington was such a champion. It turns out that John Lewis, the youngest speaker on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, was in a real fight with the organizers of the March on Washington on what he could actually say. I mean, they were in a fight, a big argument. And it turns out, and you know this, that the iconic Rosa Parks had to flee Montgomery for her life and move to Detroit. And so, you know, 50 years later, we talk about how wonderful they were and how everybody acknowledged how great they were. Nobody was acknowledging how great they were. Not then. So that's really interesting. Okay? Number 15, put a star beside it. I liked reading this. Dr. King chafed that his gift of oratory alone could not move entrenched segregation. I just read a business book that said, here's something you won't like to know: motivational speakers accomplish nothing. and I read that and I said, oh my goodness. What matters is organization and systems and teamwork and planning and execution. Fascinating. Okay. Number 21, and again I'm skipping a lot so you want to read some of these. Love is the central motif of nonviolence. Love is the force by which God binds man to himself and man to man. Such love goes to the extreme. It remains loving and forgiving even in the midst of hostility. It matches the capacity of evil to inflict suffering with an even more enduring capacity to absorb evil, all the while persisting in love. Now we come, number 3, chapter 3, Freedom Rides 1, the Nashville Initiative 61, and then the next one is Freedom Rides 2, King to Kennedy's in National Politics. Okay, so if you don't know this, primarily a bunch of college students. They said, we're going to go crash all the places. And so black and white students together would take these rides, hundreds of them. They would get on buses and they would go to these places. And if you drive through some of the cities of the South, there will be plaques next to buildings that used to be the Greyhound bus station. There's not many Greyhound bus stations left anymore in the same way that they were. And so they would ride on these freedom rides. Not until October 19, 1960, over his father's objections, did King accept persistent invitations to join Atlanta students protesting a segregated lunch counter at the prestigious Rich's department store. It was King's 4th arrest since the bus boycott had begun, the first in which he deliberately sought to be jailed. And I had forgotten that, you know, we all know about the letter from Birmingham jail when he was arrested and put in the jail and wrote that letter. But he was arrested a lot of times. And the iconic picture of him, if you've seen it, sitting in the jail cell in Birmingham was not taken when he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail, but when he had to go back to jail in Birmingham in '67. He wrote the letter in '63. He had to go back to jail in '67 because there was an outstanding warrant on him. And so that, I did not know that. Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee, stressed the GOP's century-old bond between Negro voters and the party of Abraham Lincoln, but did not specifically mention King's plight. Nixon's opponent, Senator John Kennedy, while cultivating the essential Democratic base in the white solid South, did place a sympathetic phone call to King's wife, Coretta. This is after some people were killed. Political experts, including Nixon in defeat, later isolated Kennedy's gesture as the cause of a razor-thin victory. The miracle phone call elevated King in national politics. You read this book and you realize that the Republicans were the ones that treated black people better up to this point. But that didn't mean they treated them with equality. And the Southerners were Democrats, and they were as racist as could be. And you might know the famous story that when Lyndon Johnson made a decision to sign these bills, Civil Rights Law and Voting Rights Act, he famously said, "We have lost the South for a generation."
Make that 3.
And he was wrong. It's been much longer than a generation. So, but that's the famous line. All right? Number 26, on Sunday, May 14, 1961, a white mob attacked and burned one bus of Freedom Riders outside Anniston, Alabama. Minutes later, a Ku Klux Klan posse severely beat the second busload on arrival at the Trailways station in Birmingham. A number of, I'll stop there. So what happened was there was promise of protection, and the protection would dissipate, and mobs would attack and beat. And this happened in many places. Okay. Number 30, less than 5 minutes after the bus door opened in Montgomery, official Washington knew that Pipes and bare knuckles nullified all the painstaking federal-state agreements. By the way, I'm too young to know this, but multiple times Dr. King would send a message to the Kennedys, President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. Does anybody know how he sent it? Telegram. Telegram was still big in the early 60s. I did not know that. Okay? And then number 31, chapter 4, Freedom Rides 2. King called Attorney General Kennedy several times with desperate appeals for help. John Lewis bridled at any overt criticism of King, but even he found himself defensively repeating Lawson's teaching that in nonviolence you do not badger people or force them beyond their commitment. Number 34, I put it in bold. A Gallup poll in June showed that 63% of all Americans disapproved of the Freedom Rides. That's what I was hinting at. Now we say without the Freedom Riders, we would not have gotten the integration and closer to equality. But then they were not accepted. All right, number 35. Now, if you want to get down on the Southern Baptist Convention, there would be similar quotes from other groups. So sensitive was King's name in public debate that the white Southern Baptist Convention, which was trying to make peace with President Kennedy after its shrill warnings against putting a Catholic in the White House, forced its seminary to apologize publicly for allowing King to discuss religion on the Louisville campus. So they invited King to discuss religion. He came, and then the criticism was so severe. All right, I'm going to pause here a minute. There's a man named Bill Benoski, who was the president of Pepperdine University and president of the University of Oklahoma, and then the president of Gaylord. And at one time he was a Church of Christ preacher. And he wrote a book called The Mirror of the Movement. It's kind of the history of Abilene Christian College lectures and the Church of Christ. I had a teacher named Carl Spain at Abilene Christian. I did not know this story. And I sought him out and thanked him for this. He stood up at the Abilene Christian lectures in the early 60s, and he said, it is a sin that must be repented of, that we are segregated in this school and we support segregation in this country. He had so many death threats. I'm uncomfortable with this being on recording, but I'll say it, it's in the book, that his wife never recovered. Never recovered. And there are stories like that everywhere. With a white person or a black person, a man or a woman who takes a stand and says, this has to change. When I sought him out, he basically said, nobody has thanked me for a long time. He's now deceased, Carl Spain. And the book is in The Mirror of the Movement, which is long out of print. Okay, I'm sorry. Number 36, chapter 5, Bob Moses is one of the many heroes that I don't know enough about. And Student Non-Violating Coordinating Committee, a youth organization that had grown out of the sit-ins. And so Moses was very involved in that. And number 38, in 1961, more than 400 Freedom Riders wound up in prison. They were put in prison in Mississippi's notorious Parchman Penitentiary. I don't know much about that, but it's a pretty bad place. Moses explored the ethics of shared sacrifice with the signature refrain. Circle this phrase, it's a great phrase. Don't we need a lot of leaders? Oh, that's good. Don't we need a lot of leaders? He was a 27-year-old New Yorker with a Harvard master's degree in philosophy. Herbert Lee, an NAACP farmer who attended Moses' registration meetings for voting. Dorr, that's working with President Kennedy, promised to drive out to Lee's farm on his next trip, but he found waiting at his office the next day. September 15, 1961, a message from Moses that Hearst had just shot Lee to death in full public view outside the Liberty Cotton Gin. So here's a man shot to death in full view because he's trying to register people to vote. All right? Look at number 43. I'll not read the final word. This is one of the racists. We killed 2-month-old Indian babies to take this country. One white voter explained succinctly to the press, and now they want us to give it away to the black. So, number 44, number 6, chapter 6, the National Firestone for Birmingham. A member of the American Nazi Party darted from the audience there to slug King repeatedly. And King, while recuperating, watched dramatic television news at the University of Mississippi. I've got to move left real quick. I'm just going to read a few of them. We're going to hit the bold ones. Number 47, King submitted to 8 days in an isolation cell where he composed a letter destined to become a classic. But the outside world, this is really helpful to me, didn't pay any attention. The outside world ignored his eloquent appeal along with the dwindling marches to jail. By the way, the Atlantic published the letter from Birmingham jail, and they still republish it like once a year. So, this was the brainchild of James Bevel and his wife Diane Nash from the Nashville workshops, the efforts of what they were doing. The next one, Paul Newman wrote the $1,000 check. Holly Bergen II, Tony Francioso III, John Forsyth, and Lloyd Bridges contributed. All right, Mahalia Jackson, in his own, number 50, in his own speech, King was hard-pressed to match the dueling headliners. This is at like 2 in the morning. Mahalia Jackson and Dinah Washington. And the three of them held the overflow crowd till 2 in the morning when young Aretha Franklin topped them all with her closing hymn. And then she slipped $400 $1 bills into the pocket of, I think, Mahalia Jackson to give to the cause. All right, number 52, intelligence reports noted that the Soviet Union brought, oh, this is big. Film of white people and Bull Connor, the equivalent of sheriff, beating children and using fire hoses and dogs. There are statues in Birmingham to this. And so intelligence reports noted that the Soviet Union broadcast 1,420 anti-U.S. commentaries about the Birmingham crisis during the 2 weeks following the settlement, and Prime Minister Milton Obote of Uganda replied with an official protest against the fire hoses and snarling dogs of Birmingham. Okay. Number 56, JFK said, we are confronted primarily with a moral issue. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. We preach freedom around the world and we mean it. We cherish our freedom here at home, but are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is the land of the free except for Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. A great change is at hand. We owe them and we owe ourselves a better country. It was one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and the freedom of all men ever made by any president. You spoke passionately to the moral issues involved in the integration struggle. All right, I'm literally about out of time. Number 65, talking about the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, what quickly swept the press of both races was the dream sequence, I Have a Dream, which stamped King's public identity. All right, there was a Birmingham church bombing. 4 little girls killed in 1963, later in the year, shortly after the March on Washington. Look at number 69. Heading home from the rally, a pair of White Eagle Scouts fired their new pistol at 2 Negro boys riding double on a bicycle, killing a 13-year-old perched on the handlebars. The Eagle Scouts told police they had no idea what made them shoot. Now, circle number 72, I've got to do this quickly. So the Birmingham church bombing, Diane Nash rode the bus to get to Birmingham. She walked into the room and tried to get Dr. King's attention, went person to person, went to a typewriter, typed it up, and that night Diane Nash presented to King, who had not given her much attention, the germ of what became his Selma voting rights campaign in 1965. If you know anything about the Selma voting rights campaign, it changed the circumstances, and Diane Nash came up with the plan. Fascinating. Okay. All right. I'm out of time, so I just read this on your own. I wish I could read them all. Turn to page 7 on your handout. At the bottom of the page, a few observations and then one takeaway. Number 1, America really, really, really did not want to change. Segregation was the desired way. It took a leader and a movement and a lot of strategy and work and wisdom and sacrifice and leaders and foot soldiers to bring about the change. Even friendships had to be sacrificed for the greater goal of the greater good. There were times when a friend of King's had to back out because they were being accused of being a communist. And let me tell you, if you think it was the I Have a Dream speech, that was a tiny piece. It wouldn't have happened without that, but it wouldn't have happened with only that. All right? Number 2, a thought and a word about the use of the word Negro. I just wanted to say that that's what was used then. Now we use other vocabulary. Number 3, there was put a star beside this one. There was so very much police brutality and public official sanctioned police brutality and citizen brutality. And so many blind eyes turned to the brutality. If you read this, you understand the distrust of African Americans and police officers. Number 4, the FBI with wiretaps and smear campaigns and complicity did not help the cause of civil rights. And yes, King had a major weakness or two that they found out about. So that's another discussion for another time. Number 5, times have changed. King communicated with telegrams. Gerald, I've never sent you a telegram. Number 6, there was more than a little infighting. This was, I knew this a little bit, but Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson and others, there was real infighting, and it really got tough when, it kind of got tougher when they got their 2 big goals, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then the next years following, what are we going to do now? And they really kind of went at each other, and that was interesting. But partly because of the sheer difficulty and vastness of the challenge. Number 7, there were so many murders. Medgar Evers and James Meredith and 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. This is a quote: the 3 missing civil rights workers turned up corpses in August, victims of a Klan lynching arranged by local officials. The deaths in Selma, the girls in Birmingham, and of course, ultimately, Dr. King himself. And here's my one lesson and takeaway. That's a typo, it should be 1. A lesson and takeaway. Read more history. Learn more history. When somebody says to you, you know, and this is mentioned in this book, the Civil War was not about slavery. Read more history. Read the Texas Ordinance of Secession and the Cornerstone speech, and just have them read it aloud, and then say, now tell me it wasn't about slavery. Okay, that's it. The King Years, Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement. I could not do it justice. I hope you found enough useful. Thank you for coming.